An important step creating a set of tables and fields is considering the field specifications. This is the set of tables that we've generated so far. Now, each of our fields here represents data of some sort. So we need to specify what type of data that our table is going to store. So for example, here the name, that's probably some sort of string, whereas for example here the price, that's probably some sort of decimal value. So if we take a closer look at an example of a table here, you can see, for example, as we're explaining here, we can see the ID, well, that looks like an integer of some sort. So we need to define this field here as an integer within this column. The name, that's probably some sort of character set of some sort, string, sorry. Description is probably a longer type of string, and type here, maybe some other string for the type, because maybe we have both numbers and letters potentially. So in addition to specifying the type of data that we want to store, we may also need to consider the behavior and the constraints of our field, of our data. There are a lot of different behavioral traits or constraints that we can assign or apply to fields, and it is well worth having a look through the documentation. I will point you towards that shortly. Now, we need to remember here that working with the Django framework, we are working in Python, and when we're working with data within the Python Django framework, we are working with Python data types generally. Now, the data that we're working with in our Django framework, those data types are going to be different to the ones that are on or within our database technology. And Django does a good job of converting the data that we send across to our database into the certain data types that are defined within our table. It might be worth it spending a little bit of time familiarizing yourself with the data types for the particular technology that you're using. Maybe eventually that information will be useful when you want to maybe make some customizations, maybe make a custom field for a particular type of data that you need to store in your database. If you're looking for Django specific data types or field types, then you're looking for the model field reference page in the Django documentation. And on the right hand side, you will see some of the field, below the field options here, you'll see some of the different field types. We'll take a closer look shortly, but let's just remind ourselves then of our table. So we're going to need to have a look at our table here, and we're going to need to match some of these fields to the Django model field types that are available. So to do that, let's just do a few. So let's start off with the name. So I mentioned, first of all, we need to understand, what data is it that we're going to be collecting or storing in this field. So we need to understand that in general terms to begin with before we make the match. So the name, let's think about this. A name is going to be mainly it's going to be characters, isn't it? Letters. So we aren't necessarily going to add any numbers. Can't imagine many people have numbers in their name. So we're probably going to need some sort of character-based data type here. So if we navigate over to the Django documentation, I've just typed in Django model field reference in Google. That's the top option. On the right-hand side here, we can see the field types. So now it's a case of just familiarizing ourselves with the field types. So we can see here, for example, we have a character field. So this character field, if we click on it, it tells us that it's a string field for small to large size strings. So we're told what it's used for, and we're given a description of the type of data that it represents, as well as some of the different properties and arguments. So here, for example, if we were to use this, we need to define the max length. So we need to define, when we generate this field, the maximum length of the string that we can actually store. Let's go back in here. For example, we want to store a URL. So a URL, we think about the characteristics of a URL. It probably has http:// So we've got some additional keys here that we need to consider. Obviously, there's a format to a URL. It has like a dot something. So maybe that needs to be enforced. So it's just a case of going back to the list here and taking a look through. And we will find that there is a specific field type for that. So we have the URL field. So if I click on that, it tells me it's a character field for a URL. validated by the URL validator. So this field, behind the scenes, Django has a built-in validator to validate the URL, to check to see if the format that we're entering into this field is the correct format specified by a typical URL. So let's think about what the price might be. So I already mentioned it most probably is a decimal field. We'll take a look at that. And stock quantity is probably some sort of number, whole number possibly. So let's take a look, see if we can find something for those two. Scroll back up again. So we have a range of different integer fields here. So we have let's just call this the standard integer field. We can find that integer field here. So we can see this is an integer value you can see the numbers in between there. So any number a whole number we want to use between there, typically we're going to be utilizing the integer field here. If we look closer, it does tell us that it does use the min value validator, max value validator to validate the input. So that is also available. Let's go back. So for example, we also need what we have here is a slug field. No, we don't need that just yet. Decimal field. Okay, so the decimal field here. So let's click into that. So it's a fixed precision decimal number represented in Python by the decimal instance. So a decimal number, we can specify the decimal places that we want to use. So here we probably would have 2 decimal places for depending on the currency that you're using, of course. So that looks like a good use there for currency, for prices. So you can see there are different properties that we can add in here, or the different attributes that we can set up. At the top here, we give some more information. So if there are any kind of mandatories that we need to include. So you can see that there is a little bit of reading through the documentation, matching up the data that we want to store within the fields. Once we're done with that, we can then go ahead and record what we're going to be utilizing here. Now you can see that the ID, the primary keys, this will be generated for us automatically. That's going to be utilizing the big auto field. So this is an auto incrementing field, which means that whenever we add new data into the table, the ID is going to increment by 1, like previously mentioned. So that's that field then. There are some other different auto fields if you take a look through the list of the Django fields. Other than that, you can see that we have the character field here. Now, something I didn't mention was the image field. So this is specifically for storing the image, the URL of where the image is placed, for example. So you can take a look at that. Now, that's about it. The decimal field, integer field, and there we go. The rest are just character fields. So for reference, we won't necessarily need to go into detail at this point, but as and when we develop the application, we can take a look at more of these specifics that I mentioned at the start. So when we think about field specifications in general, we need to think about maybe a name. Now, typically if we are creating a field, we may produce documentation. So we may want to describe the field, what it's for, and what it's used for, the purpose of the field. So some other kind of physical attributes we might need to consider, for example, the data length. So we saw that the character field had a mandatory attribute, which was the max length. So we needed to define, for example, the max length. Now the data type, of course, that is corresponding to the Django fields that we're utilizing. We saw that potentially we need to consider decimal places in some cases. And in other cases, we need to consider the character types. We need to ask ourselves what character types are needed for particular fields. And of course, we then go ahead and match that field with a Django field. If we were generating documentation for our database, we would potentially need to document all this information regarding specific fields that we're working with. So we do have some other logical attributes that we need to consider. So we may also record and identify, like we've done previously, the primary keys or the different types of keys that we might be utilizing. In our Django model, we might define uniqueness, whether the property or the field is unique or not. So in addition to the primary key, which is a unique field throughout our table, we may have other unique fields. So for example, here in our model, our product model, we most likely want to make the name of our product unique, potentially. Now, that might be a business decision that you might make. You don't have to do that, but there are fields where potentially you might decide, in actual fact, you only want to have unique characters, or you want that field to be unique throughout the table. So you can actually set that individually within Django. So we need to maybe think about null support, whether we want to actually have null fields or not. And you can read a little bit about that. There's some technical detail there about null fields. We don't need to know too much at this point. We may need to, I spelled that wrong there, input. So we may need to record how that data is inputted. So who should have access to inputting that data, whether it be by the system or by the user. So does it get generated by the application, or is it potentially user inputted, for example? So is it required? So what we're going to find is that some fields we might decide that it isn't required. So take, for example, if we were going to build a kind of a user table, we might have some specific metadata that we want to record about the user. For example, their name, well, we know that already, maybe their position, their employment position, maybe their hobbies. And of course, that isn't always going to be filled in. So sometimes we want to maybe define specifically that fields are required. Otherwise, the opposite, of course, here now, fields are required. So if a user was going to sign up, or we were going to enter data into the database about a user, then of course their username probably is going to be really important and is required. So we can actually specify that within our fields. So the default, so we might need to specify maybe if someone doesn't enter something into the table, maybe there is a default that we add. For example, we've seen that the value range can be specified, so we can specify, and that can be a property of the field. And then we have editing rules. So here we're talking about a little bit more about security here. We need to think about who can access this data. So this is all maybe documented, regarding our table and our fields when we're developing our table and fields. So some other considerations that we don't necessarily have to think about at this point, but potentially later in the project we will start to consider. For example, who can edit the data.